tonight because it's something that's very interesting that you need to know. If a man has a free will, does that mean that with his free will, he might be working against God? Is he free at all odds with the biblical teaching that God has and denies the fact that God is all-powerful by having a free will? Is man a robot? And does he have limited choices in such a narrow field that to not do what God says, he becomes the master of God? Can a man contradict the will of God and be pleasing to him? Or does God give us an opportunity to choose? And if we make a choice, can we make a choice against the will of God and be pleasing to God? And why did God, in the first place, create man? What was his purpose? Did he create man because he didn't have anything else to do? Or did he create man because man could then be put in a crucible of experiment and be able to show to God that he was worthy of what God had intended after this earth was over? If you were someone that had $1 billion to give to somebody, would you just hand it to them? Or would you try to find out if they were worthy of that gift? And if that gift would destroy them? Or if they were capable of receiving it, would it be something that they could have and would enjoy? The Bible teaches us in 2 Peter 3:9 that God is not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance. Yet the Bible also says not everybody will be saved. In Matthew 7 and verse 13 and 14, strive to enter in at the strait gate. For broad is the way and beautiful the gate that leadeth unto life, and few there be that find it. But strait is the gate and narrow the way, that is, that leadeth unto life, and few there be that find it. Is there a way that is right and cannot be wrong? Is there a way that's wrong and cannot be right? Does it mean that God cannot do what he wants to do in all places and in all things and in all cases, and that he is not really as powerful as people say that he is? When God created the world, were there children there who rebelled against him? When they rebelled against him, they ate of the forbidden fruit. What if there was no tree of the knowledge of good and evil in the Garden of Eden? Would they have found another way to sin? Or was it that fruit that was the problem? In Joshua 24:15, Joshua said, choose this day whom you'll serve, whether the God of the Amorites or the Hittites or the Jebusites, in whose land ye dwell. But as for me and my house, we'll serve the Lord. In Deuteronomy 30 and verse 19, Moses set before the children of Israel life and death, that of which they could choose. In 1 Thessalonians, the 5th chapter and the 21st verse, Paul says you could choose either good or evil, good or bad. If we can choose, doesn't it necessarily have to follow that we will always make the wrong choice? All the time? Or sometimes? And just by the fact that you choose, you're approving of that God had intended, and therefore God cannot find you wrong and in error because he let you choose. Choice is something that people do not understand. Because they don't understand it, it contradicts their system of philosophy. The very fact that God is has nothing to do with choice. Before choice came along, God is, was, and ever would be. But when God created, He put us into a position to where we could determine if we were worthy of what He had in mind after creation in this world came into existence. Is it always easier to rebel than to follow? Is the rebel the one that's applauded? Or is the obedient the one that is applauded by God? Can we work out our salvation with fear and trembling? Or do we have it by predestination or foreordination, and we don't have to work at it at all? Does God then not come along and help us by pointing us to the right path? But when He has pointed us to the right path, is His obligation over? If His obligation was over and He pointed us to the right path, did He wash His hands of man? Or did He send His Son to the world that the world might understand the love of God? Does He force us to make up our minds and gives us no option? The tree of good and evil in the Garden of Eden existed. If it had never been pointed out to Adam, would there have ever been a possibility that Adam would have sinned? And if Adam hadn't eaten the tree of good and evil, would he have sinned anyway? Did Eve sin when she ate of the tree of knowledge of good and evil? And because it affected her in no way, did she stand around a day or two and figure out, well, it's not having an effect on me. I'm going to try it on Adam, see what it'll do to him? And so because it had no effect on Eve, she was going to try it on Adam because God had made a covenant with Adam. And did Eve respect that covenant at all? If you think you can run a mile and you sit in your chair and never get up and run, why worry about how tired you'll be? How would you know unless you had opportunity to prove it? How could you be a judge of your condition and situation if both of your legs had been blown off? What would be the consequence if there was no opportunity to prove it? God had a special people called Israel. They were chosen. They were to be the light of the world to the heathen nations around them. God protected them, gave them their own special way, gave them every advantage you would think, and encouraged them to follow His will. They didn't. The Israelites chose to rebel. What were the consequences? Do we understand the difference between predestination, foreordination, and foreknowledge? Have we been confused by the very fact that God might have used people to their disadvantage and therefore taken advantage of the people that He used, and might have blessed other people without their right of choice and therefore blessed them because they did as He commanded? Was this right of foreknowledge that was possessed only by God? And was prophecy not a hint that man might have been able to understand things that would happen in the future that had not come to pass as of yet? And when that prophecy was fulfilled, did it not prove that God had the right handle on the situation? When Job began to argue with God, it wasn't long in the debate that Job wanted to get out of that debate. God asked him some questions that Job would have had no answer or ability to answer or comprehension to understand. And because of that, Job could see that he was on an unequal playing field, and see that the wisdom of the being with whom he was trying to discuss things that he had no comprehension or ability to know was so far beyond him in ability and knowledge and comprehension and understanding that he'd rather shut it off than to be made so foolish and look so ridiculous. Let him that thinketh he standeth take heed lest he fall. If foreknowledge was something that God alone possessed, did he use his great advantage to override and overburden his will on people that didn't want what God had to offer? And because they didn't want it and rebelled against it, he condemned them anyway? Would Judas have ever been faithful to the Lord had he not been brought into the ministry of Christ? Would he have been saved after the blood of Christ had been shed in another manner or means? Or was he put in a position that because he acted as he did, was it God's fault? Did God give him a choice? Did God abuse him? Did God cause Judas to be a laughingstock to the world because Judas wanted to stand up against God and express that he had a right that he had no right to express? Was it predetermined that Judas would be the apostle that would betray Christ? Or could the other apostles, Peter, James, John, could they have betrayed Christ and Judas gone free? And what made the difference? What is this concept of foreordination? It was before ordained. What was before ordained? That certain individuals would be obedient and certain individuals would not? Or that God would have and find amongst men a classification that was distinctively different than other classifications of people? Why was Cain rebellious and Abel not? Why did Cain raise up against Abel and kill him? Was it because he was angry at Abel? Or was it because he was angry at God and was going to show God that he did not have to do what God had commanded him to do? All of these questions are things that people don't ever discuss in a lot of frame of reference. They never really get down to foreordination. Oh, now I know John Calvin and the boys have talked about predestination. They couldn't spell it, but they wrote about it. And frankly, John Calvin was a very literate and very incisive student of the Scriptures. John Calvin just decided it was going to be his way, and he didn't pay too much attention to God as to what God had to say. But what if some do not believe? Shall it make the faith of God of none effect? God forbid. Let God be true, and every man a liar. When we stand before the judgment seat of Jesus Christ, and the Church of Christ is the only thing that's going to stand in judgment at the judgment bar, is it that God is determining whether or not we'll spend eternity with them, or has that already been decided? And was it decided because in the day in which we lived on this earth, we were tested and tried and became a proven commodity? And was that we are speaking about in the foreordination of God, that God may find people who would love Him and keep His commandments, and that we who do that were worthy of an opportunity and a chance to obtain eternal life? God pick on us? Or did He give us a chance? Did He bring us into existence to hold us in front of the fires of hell so that we'd have to do what He had said for us to do, even in spite of what we wanted to? Or did He show us the consequences of choice? And because those consequences of choice were shown, did it not reflect in every aspect of life that we'd be involved in? In homes, between a man and his wife, between a father and his son, between a man and his other children. Is it not that what God is teaching us is not the only thing that has to do with the soul, but it has to do with society? And when we decide that we do not act as a father, and that our children do not have consequences of disobedience, are we not making fun of God to His face and declaring that He really didn't know what He was doing to start with? Is punishment evil? Or in Isaiah 45, when God said, I created evil, what was it that God was really doing but creating the opportunity and the choice that those who are children of God, because of their bloodline or because of their father or mother, would be obedient? Or was what God was doing was testing and trying all of those whom He had brought into existence by the process of procreation that would be different? Why was Cain bad and Abel obedient? Why is it that man seems to have a proclivity to always be on the wrong side of the question? Why were men's thoughts evil continuously? After the example of the garden, after the death of Abel, after the trouble with Cain, don't you think they would have caught on that they couldn't withstand God? Was it because they had to have their way so badly that they denied God and rejected everything that He commanded because they were God and He wasn't? We'll be studying all these things and going over, trying to find out, first of all, if God actually did foreordain punishment before He ordained blessing. If He actually made hell before He created the earth. If Satan actually sinned, and he didn't have a tree of knowledge of good and evil, and if Satan was duped and put on a frying pan and fire and heated up so that he became an idiot instead of following the God that had shown him preeminence, position, and power. What is foreordination? Then we get to the New Testament, because now we're fast forwarding. And Paul comes up with this by the inspiration of the Spirit. For we know that all things work together for good to them who love the Lord and are called according to His purpose. Them whom He foreknew, He also predestinated. Them who He predestinated, He predetermined would be saved. They, being the them, was a classification that came into existence not as an afterthought, but at the origin of the mind that brought in to this civilization that we now have, that would allow us to go to heaven or hell before there was ever one of those offered. Think about this, because it is something we all need to understand. And since we can understand it, there's no reason to shy away from it. And are you foreordained? Were you a part of the predestinated? There's no use to wonder had it been predetermined, because predetermination is not foreordination, and it is not a classification of people. It's a law. And were you given the right to choose? And was the greatest disadvantage ever given to man by God the right to choose? If you're here and need to respond to the invitation of the gospel, Jesus didn't even give you a choice. He didn't say, hey, if you want to come in an altar and pray, be my guest. If you want to see white lights and hear angels sing, if you want to have a feeling better felt than told, if you don't want to do anything, you just sit back there in your pew and say a little prayer to Jesus in your heart, you got it made, man. Or did he say, he that believeth and is baptized shall be saved? But then he added, and he that believeth not shall be damned. You think he had the right to determine the credentials, and then when we wouldn't follow the plan, he had or assumed or took, abused or used his right to sentence us to eternal damnation? If you're here and need to respond to the invitation, will you come as we stand and sing?